Hey everyone, Steven here, and today I have the Samsung G50D in for review. Now, the original G5 monitor is special for the channel just because it's the most viewed video that I have, sitting at roughly 1.2 million views currently. In fact, most of the Samsung reviews I do on the channel end up performing very, very well. People really like the Samsung Odyssey monitors, and since my review of the original G5 over 4 years ago, they've come up with some updated versions of the exact monitor as well as some other variations of it, like the one I'm reviewing today. I've actually reviewed a previous version of this exact model, which is the G50A, about 3 years ago, and I'll cover some of the differences between these various models in the review, but it's not going to be a super in-depth comparison. With that being said though, the structure of this video will be like all of my other reviews, where I'm going to cover the specs, in-panel settings, and my test results before getting into what I like, potentially don't like, and the gray area before wrapping the video up. The Samsung G50D is a 32-inch IPS panel monitor with a 1440p resolution and a 180Hz refresh rate with a 1 millisecond gray-to-gray response time. This has a typical brightness of 350 nits, a minimum brightness of 280 nits, and a peak brightness of 400 nits. This also has 8 local dimming zones and is HDR 400 certified. This has a 1000:1 static contrast ratio, which is standard with IPS panels, and this has a mega dynamic contrast ratio, which usually means it's in the millions to 1, and then this covers 99% of the sRGB color gamut. For ports, this has one DP 1.2, one HDMI 2.0, and a headphone jack. This also has a service USB port, but that would just be to update the firmware. For physical adjustments, this can raise and lower 4.7 inches. This can swivel to the left and right 30 degrees. This can tilt 2 degrees forwards and 25 degrees backwards, and this can pivot 92 degrees in either direction. This does have a 100mm by 100mm pattern if you wanted to mount this, and inside of the box you will find the monitor, arm, base, DP cable, HDMI cable, power brick with cable, and then the user manual. Quick note about the base plate. This is a screwless design. I've never seen this before. This features like a press pin for the arm to attach to the base. It's actually pretty interesting to see because you kind of swivel this and then it holds very tight, but I thought that was pretty unique, and I do like the direction they went with this. This has a 1-year limited warranty, and Samsung offers extended warranties at $150 a year. But for that price, I think it would be a ripoff. You could just double that and you'd get a brand new monitor. You may even find it cheaper than that on sale. Shifting over to the panel menu, the menu button is a multi-button layout on the bottom middle of the panel. Clicking in the center button brings up the quick access menu, where you will have return in the center, main menu on the top, input select on the left, power button on the bottom, and eye care on the right. If you don't click in the main menu button first, you have the quick access menu buttons as the 4 buttons around the center one. The top button brings up brightness, sharpness, and contrast. The left and right buttons will bring up the input select, and the bottom brings up the volume control. Clicking into the main menu though, this is the same menu layout as the original G5. Here though, for the tabs, you have game, picture, on-screen display, system, and support. For the game tab, you have refresh rate, response time, adaptive sync, low input lag, black equalizer, virtual aim point, and screen size. You'll notice that at the top you have the black equalizer, response time, refresh rate, adaptive sync, and low input lag icons, where it's just giving you a quick glance at what you actually have turned on and what those settings are. If you turn adaptive sync on, you will only have that illuminated as well as the black equalizer, because you can't change the response time, refresh rate, or low input lag. Turning on adaptive sync will allow you to enable the NVIDIA G-Sync compatibility mode, but if you leave it off, you have the option to adjust the refresh rate, response time, and that low input lag. For refresh rate, you have 60, 120, 144, and 180. For the response time, you have standard, faster, and extreme. For low input lag, it's either on or off. We have the black equalizer, the virtual aim point, and then for the screen size, you have wide and auto. Next up, you have the picture tab. Here you will have picture mode, brightness, contrast, sharpness, color, tint, local dimming, which has off, low, standard, and high. Then you have contrast enhancer, which has off, low, and high. Then you have HDR tone mapping. This has active or static. You have color tone, white balance, gamma, shadow detail, color space, black level, eye saver mode, screen adjustment, and picture reset. Going back to the picture mode, which are the picture presets, we have entertain, graphic, eco, game standard, RPG, RTS, FPS, sports, original, and custom. I've used graphic and original for most of the footage in this video. After this, you have the color tone, which is the color temperature modes. Here you have cool, standard, warm 1, and warm 2. The panel leans a little cool, so I've kept this on warm 1 for most of the footage in this review. Next, we have the HDR tone mapping. You have static and active. Static seems like it has more contrast to it versus active, which is going to react to what's on screen. I've generally left this on active. I think it's better than static, but overall I will say it is a minimal difference between the two modes when you're actually gaming. Next, I didn't record any footage of this. It's something that doesn't really come across to my camera, but for color space, you don't have different options like DCI-P3, wide gamut, sRGB. It's just auto and native. Most of the footage in this review, this is going to be on native. Next up, we have the on-screen display tab. Very basic, just language and display time, which is either 20 seconds or 200 seconds. You can't change the location of the OSD, which is a bummer, and then you can't change the transparency of it. It's just this set transparency that you have here. And then last, we have the systems tab. Here you have see colors mode. It says right there, choose color filters to help you see things on the screen more clearly. So kind of like a colorblind mode. Save energy, volume, off timer plus, PC/AV mode, display port version. And this is obviously upscaling, it says, from the 1.2, input port version, auto source switch, key repeat time, power LED on, and then set up custom key. Shifting into my results, starting with the on-screen response time testing tool. Here we are looking at the speed of the panel, which they are saying is 1 millisecond gray to gray for the response time. Here, I'm not getting 1 millisecond. The testing tool is different too, so the results are really to just feed into their claims. There are any other test results that you may find on the internet, and the current results on screen right now are with adaptive sync on. If you turn that off, you can actually adjust the overdrive. You have the standard, faster, and extreme that I will look at here in a second. With adaptive sync, most of the time we're trying to turn that on. We can enable G-Sync compatibility mode and reduce any potential for screen tearing. Here, what I will say is the panel is actually slower. So if you have a really good GPU, I actually wouldn't use this mode, which is pretty rare. Usually I just use adaptive sync and then leave G-Sync compatibility mode turned on. But I'm going to look at the faster here in a second, which I think is kind of the best option for anybody. Again, if you do have a newer 3000 series GPU or higher. Looking at the numbers here though, for average complete time, this is 11.46 milliseconds. When we're looking at the perceived response time, that is just going to be the overall response time depending on the transition going from black to white and back to black. For RGB overshoot, we don't have any. What does that mean? You don't see any inverse ghosting with this mode, which is awesome. For the visual response rating, it's taking the information from the perceived response time, averaging it with the RGB overshoot, and then rating it with this. So it gets a good B with this. When we're looking at all the other numbers here, you can look at the black to white to black transition there. That took 15 milliseconds. That's going to be the 02550 on the graph here. And then looking at the best, 3.7, worst, 11.4. So you can kind of see where it's struggling on the perceived response time chart there, and then where it's doing a little bit better. Shifting over to standard for the overdrive here. So this is again with adaptive sync now turned off. Looking at the results, the average complete time, 11.84 seconds. It's similar to adaptive sync, but it's actually slightly slower with some of the numbers here. And you can just see that if I was just to look at the coloring of it, you can see that it is just, again, slightly slower, but we don't have any RGB overshoot here, so no inverse ghosting. Visual response rating, it's still getting a B. For our 02550, 19.6 now for that. So we went from 15 to 19.6, and then we have our best at 4.7, and then our worst at 11.8. Shifting over now to faster, this is where you see this is actually doing something. Sometimes you deal with overdrives and they'll actually get slower, so you'll get worse results for the perceived response time, and then you'll get a lot of RGB overshoot, so you get a bunch of inverse ghosting. And so here, average complete time, 9.92 seconds. It got faster. Now your 02550 is 18.2, so it isn't as good as adaptive sync, but best is 3, worst is 9.3. You see a couple numbers pop up on the RGB overshoot. Visually, you won't even see this, so you won't see any inverse ghosting when it comes to running a UFO test, for example. And then with the visual response rating here, we're still getting a solid B. The best is a little bit higher here, but overall, this is actually the mode that I've left this in for most of the footage in this review. That's very rare. Usually I just use the adaptive sync. I use that G-Sync compatibility like I mentioned, but here I've left it in this mode. I think it is the optimal mode to be in, again, if you do have a newer GPU. I will note though, I can tell the difference. It's very subtle between adaptive sync being on and using this mode. I don't think if you're a casual gamer, if you're an entry-level gamer, you're going to actually notice that. So if you feel better just having adaptive sync turned on, just leave it in that mode. This is for anybody out there that maybe your eye is a little bit more keen on seeing those subtle differences. Shifting over now to the extreme mode, this is where we see it got bad. So here, average complete time, 12.73. But if you look at the perceived response time, your average numbers across the board are bad. They just went way up. We see a lot of red now. Your 02550, 18.4, best 3.6, worst 12.6. But again, if you're looking at the map there, you just see it is mainly red. So across the board, it didn't get faster, it got slower. And then you see it in this same block show up as RGB overshoot. So now you see a lot of inverse ghosting, and that'd be the number one reason why you want to use this, is because you're just going to see that inverse ghosting with all the images that you have. And then of course the visual response rating is going to go down. The best 92, the worst 66. But if you look at the average with this, we're now in a C. We're not in a B anymore. We dropped down about 10 points. Shifting over now to the results from the Spyder X color calibration tool. Here they don't list the gamut modes. Usually you'll see like a wide gamut mode, and then they'll say DCI-P3, sRGB. We don't have that. We have native and auto. I did run this with one of the picture presets just to check, and then I went ahead and ran all of them just to see, and they do have their own separate results, so it does get a little bit interesting here. But looking at native, the claim here is 99% coverage of the sRGB color gamut. I actually found that with native, I have 100% coverage. And then we have 81% coverage of the Adobe RGB, 86% of the DCI-P3, and then 78% of the NTSC. When I ran native with the graphics preset, it was 100% for the sRGB, 81% for the Adobe RGB, 90% for the DCI-P3, so it went up 4%, and then 80% for the NTSC, that went up 2%. Now with the other picture presets, subtle differences, maybe a percentage here or there outside of eco, and that one just across the board with any monitor usually just has less because they're not pumping as much power into the monitor. When it comes to auto though, we have 99% coverage for the sRGB, 74% of the Adobe RGB, 76% of the DCI-P3, and then 69% of the NTSC. That's just standard. I just click it into that. I don't touch anything. I just see where it falls. If you go back through and then click on one of the picture presets, this is where the results will then change, which I do find interesting. So now I'm showcasing using auto, that's on the far right, and then changing the picture presets. Now by default, when I ran auto, I had it on original, but it changed. So looking at original in the middle, we have 97% of the sRGB, 79% of the Adobe RGB, 83% of the DCI-P3, and 77% of the NTSC. So looking there, sRGB went down by 2, Adobe RGB went up by 5, DCI-P3 went up by 7, and then NTSC went up by 8. I didn't change anything. Again, I ran auto with original first, and then I went in and switched it. So I'm not 100% sure what's going on when you're adjusting these modes here. But with native, I didn't find much of a difference after that. So when I went and ran the other picture presets, it was very subtle, where here I am finding it's actually a difference between each mode. I'm not going to showcase all of those, but if we look at graphics here, 94% coverage of the sRGB, 70% of the Adobe RGB, 69% of the DCI-P3, 65% of the NTSC. So it actually went down from auto, and then it went down from original as well. Overall, it's just worse, where with native, that wasn't the case. And this is just to provide more information than what Samsung is providing when they say 99% coverage of the sRGB color gamut. With this, I suggest don't use auto, use native, and then any of the picture presets are going to be pretty solid across the board. I did find graphics to be slightly ahead and original to be slightly ahead of the others, but again, we're talking like 1 or 2% here or there. They're all pretty close, but those ones do seem to be a little bit better. For anybody that does content creation, works in Adobe Premiere Pro, Photoshop, anything like that, and you need a very specific color gamut coverage, obviously you can look at my results here. In general, this isn't a monitor that I would use for something like that because it is more geared towards gaming. But if you do both and you're on a tight budget, it could be passable for some of that work. I would probably save up my money though, and then really get something like a Pro Art display if I could. I know those are really expensive, but just depends on the level that you're at. Again, this is more entry level when it comes to gaming, and especially when it comes to these color gamuts here, if you were doing any work in those applications. Shifting over now to consoles and what you can do with those. Interesting setup here. So you can upscale to 4K with this. You cannot do that if adaptive sync is turned on. So here just showcasing everything that you can do with adaptive sync turned off. So you can do 4K 60 Hz with HDR. You cannot do 120 Hz with that though. Here looking at what's grayed out, it'll say like variable refresh rate is always on, but it's grayed out, so technically you can't use it. And then with the HDR, it says the Dolby Vision is checked, but you can't use it, which is interesting. But if you turn adaptive sync on, 1440p 120 Hz is what you can do. You can also do that if adaptive sync is turned off. What that gives you though is the ability to upscale to the 4K. So if you want to do that, then again, you have that option, which I do like. A lot of times that may not be an option with a lot of monitors. But as you can see here, with adaptive sync turned on, it is saying variable refresh rate is an option. Auto low latency, regardless of the mode, is not though. So here, we're looking at the adaptive sync turned off. It's only showing 1440p with this though. So if you change this and you go check and you're like, well, it's not working, you can actually cycle back through some of the other menus and then just see if it pops up, and it should. It may be just that quick adjustment that you make doesn't allow it to catch up. And you can see right here, I've turned adaptive sync off. Go to the 4K details. It's showing everything is there. I backtrack, and a second ago it only showed 1440p for the highest resolution, but it now will show that you can upscale to the 4K. Just keep in mind, you can't do 120 Hz. You can only do the 60 Hz. For the PlayStation, we end up with similar results. You can do 1440p up to 120 Hz. You can do the same for 1080p, and that would be the same for the Xbox as well. If you wanted to do 1080p 120 Hz, that is an option. You do get the HDR with both of those modes as well, but VRR is not supported across the board. So as I go to try to actually enable that, it will say it's not an option. With the Xbox, that was if you had adaptive sync on, which I think is interesting. PlayStation, adaptive sync is on right now. You don't have VRR. You don't have the auto low latency mode either with this. With this one though, we get the similar results of actually just turning off adaptive sync. You will find that you can do 4K 60 Hertz with this then. But again, you can't do 120 Hertz. It does allow for HDR, but if you wanted the 120 Hertz, you're gonna need to drop that down to 1440p. But I do like the fact that with both the Xbox and the PlayStation 5, you can upscale to 4K 60 Hertz with HDR. Or if you wanted to, again, you can do the 1440p 120 Hertz with HDR, but you have a good amount of options when it comes to consoles. That isn't always the case, so I do like seeing that with this monitor. So now that I've covered the specs, in-panel settings, and my test results, let's get into what I like about this monitor, starting with the overall picture quality, which is really good, especially considering the price tag, which is what I have to judge all of these monitors based on. It is better than the original G5, but I'm going to cover that in greater detail in a little bit. The fidelity here is great, with the in-panel settings allowing for a solid amount of options you can adjust, which is a big plus. The picture presets here are actually good enough that I think you can just use one of those with minimal to no adjustments to get it to your liking, unlike the original G5, which needed a lot of adjustments to get the picture to look good. Most of my footage in this video is with the graphics and casual picture mode, like I mentioned earlier, and the colors with this are really vibrant. Performance, of course, matters directly in relation to the visuals, meaning if it looks great but doesn't perform very well, you're not going to want to get this monitor, and vice versa. I was expecting this to be slightly better than the original G5, just based on the difference in the panel type, but I wasn't expecting this to be quite this good. It is very solid on the performance end. Now, I'm not saying this is going to beat a much higher tier monitor like an OLED or even a higher end IPS panel, but it still does really well. In fact, this is the first monitor that I've used where I've turned adaptive sync off and I've just used the overdrive mode. Now, I'm not hitting the 1 millisecond gray to gray response time that Samsung is claiming with this, but running the UFO test, you don't see a lot of ghosting like you would find on a VA panel. It's still there, but actually as you increase the overdrive, you do get rid of it. Again, when I go into extreme, you do get inverse ghosting, but if you leave this on faster, it is a very good sweet spot that outperforms adaptive sync if you have the GPU for it. Now, if you're running an older GPU, maybe like 1000 series or lower, you may be concerned with some potential screen tearing. You can always turn adaptive sync on and then enable the G-Sync compatibility mode, and that will reduce the likelihood that you have any screen tearing. Just keep in mind you are sacrificing a little bit of speed when it comes to the panel. Using the faster mode, I've had zero screen tearing personally, but I have an RTX 4080 Super. Now, there is a 27-inch version of this monitor that would have greater pixel density, and so with that, it may potentially look a little bit better on the visuals with this, just because you're going to get a little bit more crispness out of everything. Performance, maybe with the smaller size, it does perform a little bit better, but I think it'd be so subtle. I don't know how much of that would actually translate to something that you're even visually going to see. It may not even be there at all. I'd actually have to run the on-screen response time testing tool on that smaller version to see. Again, I think it would be there, but it'd be very, very subtle. Next, I do like the HDR here, but I want to clarify some things with this. As far as I can tell, this isn't true 10-bit color. This is going to be 8-bit plus FRC. So if you do any work in applications where you do need true 10-bit color, this isn't going to be the right monitor for you. For everybody else, your eye visually most likely isn't going to tell the difference between the 8-bit plus FRC and true 10-bit color. And here we do have local dimming, but it's only 8 zones. A lot of times you would find like 16 local dimming zones on some of the earlier kind of mid-range monitors that had local dimming. Here it's 8, and it is somewhat apparent depending on what's going on screen. If you're running a test, and they have the videos on YouTube where you can actually see like a white square or circle kind of move around the screen, and you can more easily tell like, oh, yep, that one's turning off, this zone's turning on, and again, it makes it more apparent. When you're gaming, it won't be as apparent. When I was playing Destiny 2, I had it on HDR, I had the local dimming, I tried it on low and then tried it on high. I actually think it looks pretty decent. Again, considering the price tag here, most people end up comparing this to an OLED or like even the Samsung G7 where you had like 1152 local dimming zones. If you're making that comparison, then this isn't going to do well. Taking into consideration the price, part of that is who's going to buy this monitor. If you want really good HDR, you're most likely getting an OLED, you're getting the G7 with all the local dimming zones, you're getting a much higher tier, more expensive monitor. If this is within your budget and you want to try out HDR, I think you will be pleasantly surprised at just how well it does perform with the local dimming zones, especially if you do a lot of console gaming. I found this across the board. You boot up the console, you make the quick adjustments to HDR, and then it's kind of like a set it and forget it. On PC, it takes a little bit more work. You may need to adjust the NVIDIA control panel, and then you need to adjust within each game. There's some subtleties to it. Consoles, again, set it and forget it. And across the board, I found with consoles, the HDR and the local dimming here does look quite nice. PC, a little bit of tinkering, but if you're willing to spend the time doing that and you get it right to where you like it, it can be a set it and forget it, because once it's kind of nailed down, you're good to go. And just circling back to consoles really quick, SDR or HDR looks really good. I like the options that you have with consoles. You had more than I was thinking, especially with the ability to upscale to 4K. I think it looks better upscaling to 4K 60 Hertz than it does 1440p 120. Just because you don't have the variable refresh rate, you don't get the auto low latency mode. I think for a lot of people that may be a bummer. They're probably going to be looking for something that does have that. But I don't notice a big difference on consoles, regardless of the monitor that I'm using, with 4K or 1440p 60 versus 120 Hertz. It kind of, to me, looks very similar, especially if I've been PC gaming at 160 to 240 Hertz. To just jump over to that, it just kind of looks like 60 Hertz to me. I'm not noticing that big increase in the overall performance when it comes to that leap between 60 and 120 Hertz. So here, I think upscale to 4K, play at 60 Hertz, it just looks better, but you don't have to do that. You do have the option for 1440p 120 Hertz with HDR, which is really nice. Last here, I do like that this has all of the mechanical adjustments, so you don't really need to mount this if you don't want to. And I also like the fact that they kept the panel molding really simple. They played it safe with this. It visually looks nice and clean. It's not very busy. There's not a bunch of noise going on with it. I appreciate that, because sometimes when you put a bunch of harsh lines on it and RGB lighting and all these other things, it tends to look noisy. And with that, it may not match the simple, clean aesthetics that you may be going for with your setup. Shifting into what I don't like, or the negatives here, I'm happy to report there's nothing that stands out as a negative with this monitor, especially considering the sales price that you can find this at. Now at the regular price, I would say you have more options to consider based on performance and extras you might find, but the sales price here is really good, and it appears to be at these prices pretty regularly. To give more exact numbers, this is normally $430, but you can grab this regularly at $280. So at $280, I think this is a really good deal. Now with that being said, there is something that I don't like that isn't specific to this monitor, but it's something that Samsung does in general. It's their $150 warranty program. For high-end monitors, that makes sense, but for this monitor, it doesn't, since that's literally over half of the sales price. I think Samsung should go the ASUS route here and just offer 3-year warranties for all of their monitors across the board. Do away with this program. People really like this brand, and when you see other companies offering the 3-year warranty, There may be a little bit more to the cost of that monitor, but I think it's worth it. If I paid an extra 30 to 50 for this monitor, but I knew it had a 3-year warranty, not a 1-year, and I'm not paying 150 for their 2-year extension warranty program, I think that would still be a really good deal because you just have peace of mind when it comes to this being able to last 3 years. Now, although I don't have any negatives, I do have a handful of gray area things, which are things you may or may not care about. Not all of these things are specific to the monitor, but things to be mindful of with IPS panels and this size of monitor at 1440p, which let's just get those out of the way first. Text clarity here is decent, but it will look more pixelated as the pixels per inch is 93. So you will need to increase the text size or run clear type if it's an issue for you. Another option here, though, is getting the 27-inch version, which will have a pixel density of 108, which isn't a massive leap, but it will improve overall clarity of text and the monitor in general. Next, IPS panel monitors do have the IPS glow to them, but here I will say it is pretty minimal compared to other IPS monitors that I've reviewed in the past, but regardless, it's still there. Now, if you use local dimming, it will actually minimize that a great deal because it's turning off those zones, but you will notice that glow in the zones that do have any white background or illuminated area to it in there, which may make it more apparent what zone you're in, because again, there's only 8 here. Now, when comparing this to a VA panel monitor, IPS panels have a faster response time and more vivid colors. And that's just a general statement there. But they do have a lower contrast ratio, so there's a little bit of a trade-out. So that's going to feed into, one, the IPS glow that you get here. If it doesn't have a really solid contrast ratio, it will be more noticeable, obviously. But if you do use the local dimming, you can actually kind of combat that a little bit. So there's some trade-out going on with that, but the local dimming can help. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I'm using HDR with the local dimming, it does look pretty decent because I'm not seeing the same amount of glow on this panel that I normally would if I didn't have the local dimming turned on. Next, this has a very matte finish to the coating on this, and it's hard to explain because I can't actually showcase it with any footage that I record, but in person, it is very sharp and crisp directly in the middle. But as you go towards the edges here, as you look at an angle, it has to do with the actual coating here. It looks a little bit more out of focus and kind of like a little soft. It's hard to describe, but you notice it in certain instances where there's just things more towards the corner that you're looking at. And again, I think this really has to do with the coating that's on here. It just is more of a matte finish than most of the monitors I've reviewed, and something that I would want people to be mindful of here. It doesn't change like the look of the colors or anything like that. It's just odd. It's very hard to describe. Now, I don't think this is a deal breaker, like you should base it just off this one thing, but I would want people to be mindful of that before they actually purchase this. And again, it's something that you're probably going to need to see in person because I just can't really showcase it with my camera. Next, all the extras that you might find if this was its normal price, you don't find here. And that's where, mentioning earlier, if it was its normal price, I would say it's more competitive. You would have more things to consider, and I would want to look around a little bit more before I decided on this one. What are those extras? We don't get any extra USB ports. You don't have any RGB lighting on this thing, which that to me is take it or leave it, but some people may want that. You don't have any speakers on this either. I think those are generally the big 3 that people are looking for. This does have all of the mechanical adjustments though, which I do appreciate. So a little bit of a trade out there. The only other thing I think would have been nice is the extra USB ports, where this doesn't have any, so you could extend from your PC to this and run your peripherals off of it, and maybe even have a KVM switch in there. Doesn't have any of this. If you're cool with the mechanical adjustments, because I do think that is such a huge plus and you don't really need those other things though, this isn't going to be something that bothers you. And last here, the menu is starting to show its age. It's actually the same menu that you had on the original G5. I think at this point, a refresh would be nice. Visually, it looks the same. The layout is the same. One of the big drawbacks, I think, in terms of the menu is the fact that you can't shifted over. So when we're looking at the on-screen display, right, the OSD, you can change the language, you can change the time. You cannot change the transparency with this model, nor can you move it off to the side. It is just stuck right there. So again, an update, a refresh, add some other things in with this. In terms of the panel settings, like with like the colors and everything, I think it does a good job. It's just, again, feeling quite dated at this point. So that's going to wrap this video up and bring me to my overall conclusion. I really like this monitor, comparing it to the original Samsung G5. Now, they've had some updates with that, and I haven't used any of those newest updates. With that, they've changed out the firmware and some other things. If it performs pretty similarly to the original though, with that, again, we were talking about the trade-outs for IPS versus VA. The big thing here is going to be the panel types. The original G5 is at VA. It has a higher contrast ratio, but it's slower. So what does that mean? You're going to see more ghosting with that version compared to this version. The overall vividness on this monitor is going to be a little bit better than the original G5. What's the draw of the original G5? It's the 1000R curve. If you want that 1000R curve, then you're going to go with that monitor over this one. If you want better performance, better colors, if you want the mechanical adjustments, because the original G5 only has tilt, then you're going to go with this version. If we're looking at the other G50A that I've reviewed, that one is going to be very similar to this. It's the same panel type. You get all the same mechanical adjustments. That one does have true 10-bit color. It's also a little bit more expensive. Even on sale, it's a little bit more expensive than this one. They still have the 27-inch and 32-inch for that one. It is the older molding, so with that, you do get RGB lighting on the back if you need RGB lighting. And then with that, it has an ultra-wide game mode where you can actually essentially create these two black bars and it turns it into an ultra-wide in the middle. Not too many people, I think, are going to use that. I tried it out when I did my review. It's okay, but on a smaller size. It's like if I wanted to do that, I would just actually get an ultra wide, but it does have that option where this monitor does not. Overall though, I would take this over those two. I just think it performs really, really well. I really like the sale price with this. And again, colors pop off screen. You're getting great visuals, great performance. There's a lot to like here.